Right, so good morning, everyone, and thank you, Helen, for the invitation to share. My name is Karis Daniel. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town, and I'm a conservation biologist by training, but my work now also incorporates aspects of ornithology and citizen science, obviously, and social ecology. And these are all sort of vague and nebulous terms, and they probably tell you very little about what I actually do. So what I'll do through the next 15 minutes or so is just maybe unpack what some of those terms are and why they're important, and then how they fit together within the broader context of conservation. So let's start with some definitions. What is biodiversity conservation? Well, broadly, it can be considered a collective effort by all relevant stakeholders within an ecosystem to understand, preserve, and protect the integrity, components, and functioning of the ecosystem. Now, I don't know about you, but something really immediately jumps out at me from that definition, and it's this word in green right here, which is to understand. What does it mean for us to understand an ecosystem? And not just in the structural sense of ecological niches and food webs and cascade effects, because this definition says all relevant stakeholders, right? And those terms, niche and food web and cascade effect, they may hold meaning for a group of biologists, but for the majority of stakeholders, they actually mean very little. And I think rather for the majority of stakeholders, understanding is going to look very different to the diagrams and the data of the scientific community. So who are these majority, and why should we be including their voices? Well, another way to phrase that same question is, who are the primary drivers of ecosystem change? Because the answer is the same. It's us, humans. In our global ecosystem, humans have, in really every sense of the word, become drivers. We manipulate, we transform, we destroy, we can protect and rebuild. And the world is quite literally our oyster. And when we're focusing on solutions in terms of conservation, which target only the natural world, we're actually neglecting to acknowledge that we're a part of it. And I've said this before in previous talks, but I just can't emphasize it enough, that biodiversity loss is a public problem. It's something that we should not be dealing with privately. We need to carefully consider the ways in which we approach conservation to ensure that people are always taken into consideration. If we want something to be protected indefinitely, we would do well to invest our time and our efforts into demonstrating to our fellow ecosystem drivers that it's worth protecting. So what constitutes worth? How is it created? Well, last year, a large network of researchers worked with the United Nations to produce a series of publications that were called the Blue Papers. And these talked about the human relationship with our ocean planet. And what I found fascinating about that research was its focus on value, specifically on the non-monetary value which humans derive from the ocean. And these included things like contributions to social identity, legal identity, sense of place, occupational pride, self-respect, spirituality, mental health, bodily health, human security. The list just went on and on. And these incredibly diverse value systems also scale up and exist on the broader scale of biodiversity. And the fact is that there are as many possible relationships with our planet's biodiversity as there are people who interact with it. There's no one definitive value that all people will identify with, because every person carries a unique set of personal and cultural connections which shape their relationship with biodiversity. And those relationships form the foundational building blocks of lifestyle. And we know from studies spanning back over the past 2 decades that people who have deep and nuanced valuations and understandings of biodiversity are more likely to lead ecologically healthy lifestyles. So human-nature relationships, our concepts of worth in nature, are incredibly important in the context of conservation. The problem actually arises when those relationships start to break down. And again, studies over the past several years in particular have demonstrated an epidemic of unhealthy and underdeveloped human relationships with the rest of nature. And these pose a significant barrier to sustainable conservation. Again, consider that people are driving our ecosystem, people who have limited understanding and knowledge of the ecosystem which they're actually driving. So suddenly understanding these values and where they come from becomes crucial. And value is still quite a broad term, so to narrow it down a bit more, there is a specific subset which I'm interested in, and these are the relational values. And these are ways of evaluating the natural world outside of an economically driven valuation system. So just as an example, many of you are probably familiar with the term ecosystem services. It's typically used to describe things like pollination, seed dispersal, and carbon sequestration. And it's things that we see as sort of really useful giveaways from the ecosystem. And though that term is slowly shifting to become more inclusive, it still typically only refers to what we would think of as instrumental values, which are basically scientific and economic assessments of environmental value. And again, this misses all of those critical relational values that we just touched on, which are things like cultural and social and biophysical and health-related and experiential values. And yeah, it's something that we really need to be taking into consideration in the context of making conservation decisions. So how are these relational values established? Well, this is where the field of social ecology can help us to hopefully find an answer. Social ecology is essentially a field dedicated to understanding those relationships between human responses to and interactions with the rest of the natural world. And also the effects of those interactions on the natural world itself. It's like a way of learning how and where people perceive value and why we assign value in the ways that we do. And there's this overarching goal of cultivating a global mentality of integration, where individuals view themselves as components of a natural system, like the diagram on the right, rather than at the top of a hierarchical structure, like the diagram on the left. Now, if I approach this field of social ecology as a conservationist, I'm immediately looking for ways to understand why people might consider something worth or not worth protecting, and how those perceptions might be shifted. So what group of people could we start with in order to answer those questions? Well, as you may have guessed from the theme of today's meetings, one solution I think is actually sitting in our pocket, and that is citizen science. If you think about it, citizen scientists exist at the interface between the biological sciences and the rest of the world. And for quite a long time, studies have focused almost exclusively on how citizen science data impacts scientific research, how it allows for the rapid accumulation of large data sets over vast geographical scales, often at minimal or even no cost to researchers. And while that's a fascinating conversation to have and generates valuable information, and actually part of my research also focuses on that, it isn't a complete picture. There's a term, I think within Japanese and Korean, called mu, which can be used as a response to a question whose context is too small for the scope of its answer. And it means something like, unask that question because there's a better one to be asked. And I think that's what we need to do when we're looking at the discipline of citizen science, because in asking what value people bring to science, what we've neglected to consider is how citizen science might be changing people. And even through just observing, it very quickly becomes apparent that something in this community is different. And citizen scientists are unique in their relationship with the rest of the natural world, in that they seem to have a deeper understanding of it. I like to say that as citizen scientists, we don't spend time outdoors, rather we invest time outdoors. And what we get back, among many other personal benefits, like those values that I spoke about earlier, is potentially an ecologically grounded worldview. And if that is the case, if participation in citizen science can build and diversify participant valuation and understanding of the natural world, It's a force to be reckoned with. And I think it's something which we're actually vastly underutilizing within the work of conservation. See, if we now have a community of people who are not scientists by training, but have a deep and rich environmental knowledge, this community becomes a bit like a bridge. Citizen scientists can stand in that critical communication divide between the scientific community and the broader public, acting as a go-between by recognizing changes in the world around them, calling attention to those changes within the scientific community and their immediate social circles, and then galvanizing local communities and governance into action. And part of what I want to achieve through my research is to present the case that careful project structure and implementation can build off of these existing strengths to create and maintain generational frameworks of environmental stewardship with families and community members passing on a deep-rooted value for biodiversity, which will then spill over into local and regional and governmental environmental policy. And what makes those frameworks so powerful is that eventually they're able to operate not outside of, but independent of the scientific community. And that really should be our goal, that we don't always need to be preaching the same message, that through these individual transformations and building these ecologically grounded worldviews, biodiversity conservation would become a chosen lifestyle by the majority of people, rather than a forced agenda from one community onto another. And science then, to continue borrowing religious terminology, can start to invest its energy into discipling even, rather than the work of conversion. So in light of all of that exciting potential, two of the questions that I'm asking within my research are how and in what ways participation in a citizen science project may influence participant knowledge and perceptions of value in the natural world. And again, because humans are ecosystem drivers, any change which we want to last has to start with individuals. And citizen science, I think, might be just the catalyst that's needed to spark that personal change. So conservation work at this level really becomes the work of reshaping or rebuilding worldviews. So how can we go about measuring this? Measuring things like values and knowledge and changes in values and knowledge. Well, we actually start with conversations. And within continental Africa, we have some amazing citizen science programs, one of which is the African Bird Atlas. And there are several chapters of it across Africa. And I've chosen to focus in on one relatively well-established chapter, which is the second South African Bird Atlas project. It's been running for decades, and a relatively new chapter, the Nigerian Bird Atlas project, which has started within the last decade. And through conducting in-depth conversational interviews with participants in these projects, I'm hoping to develop an understanding of the influence of citizen science participation on relational values and knowledge surrounding nature. And specifically, I'm looking at those 4 questions listed on the left, which have been chosen and worked and reworked with the guidance of one of my co-supervisors, Dr. Jacqueline Lewis. And within the study design, the level of involvement in a project is also really key. We need to conduct interviews with people at varying distances or almost degrees of relatedness to the citizen science project itself. So both regular members and casual members of the Atlassian community, non-participants who know about the project, as well as non-participants who are unaware of the project. And in an ideal world, that would be feasible, but with constraints of time and me being one person, another way to sort of work around that is to interview new participants before they become deeply involved in the Atlas, and then to follow up with a second interview after the same individuals have participated in a certain number of events, outings, counts, etc. And that will then help us to determine what may have shifted in relation to level of involvement in the project. And if participation in a citizen science project does influence participant perceptions of value and knowledge of the natural world, then broadly, we would expect those with more involvement in projects to articulate an increasingly nuanced understanding of what constitutes nature, a more integrated sense of place within nature. If you think back to that diagram of the hierarchy versus the holistic circle, a deeper understanding of local ecosystem structure and functions, so things like species composition and assemblages and habitat. And finally, also an improved understanding of the conservation significance of biodiversity. And my suspicion is that many, if not all of these, go hand in hand. That developing a conservation mindset requires a complex interaction between both values and knowledge of the natural world. So in the end, what will these conversations be able to tell us? Well, it's a bit like a clinical trial, which I mentioned this last time as well. It's very apt in our current global circumstances. If you think of biodiversity loss as a disease caused, among many other reasons, by unhealthy human relationships with nature, and if we then think of citizen science as a new therapeutic medication, this study is like a way of monitoring how effective the drug is at fighting the disease. It's a way of determining the impact of our citizen science projects on individuals and communities within the greater context and goals of conservation. So to wrap up everything I've covered in the last probably more than 15 minutes, sorry. Successful biodiversity conservation requires that a majority of the population has a healthy relationship with the natural world. And that change then has to start with reshaping individual worldviews. And citizen scientists occupy a unique position to serve as really powerful intermediaries between the scientific community and the broader public. And we can potentially strengthen that position by structuring our projects in ways which maximize their social impact. But in order to do that, we first need to understand the current impact of our projects. You may have been wondering why I chose to title this talk, "It Takes a Village." And it's one of my favorite old proverbs, or one of several old proverbs, which roughly says, "It takes a village to raise a child." And I just love that statement for conservation because it's a statement of collective social responsibility, that all members of the community play a part in a child's growth and flourishing. And our world, especially with increasing globalization, has really become our village. And as I hope that I've demonstrated through talking through these different fields and components of conservation and how we need the data and how we also need the people, we need collective and interdisciplinary action in order to effect change and in order to protect our biodiversity for the following generation. It really does take a village. And this is only a portion of the project which I'll be immersed in over the next couple of years. I think I mentioned earlier, there's also a data-based component looking at the value of the data generated by citizen scientists. But yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to share. I'm keen to hear any thoughts or questions you may have after Liz and Ryan's talks as well. Thanks.